welcome back to Levant TV's Press Review. Today we continue monitoring analysis on the Syrian crisis and looking at Iran's nuclear deal, which might happen after today's talks in Geneva. Let's begin as usual by taking a look at today's front pages here in the UK. The Guardian leads its front page reporting on documents from whistleblower Edward Snowden, who says phone, internet and email records of British citizens not suspected of any wrongdoing have been analysed and stored by America's National Security Agency under a secret deal that was approved by UK intelligence officials. It also reports on the use of antidepressants surging across the rich world over the past decade, raising concerns amongst doctors that pills are being overprescribed. It also features a picture of Greenpeace activist Alexandra Harris after a St. Petersburg court granted her bail on charges relating to an Arctic protest. The Independent leads its front page reporting on MPs outraged as head of a controversial private outsourcing firm blames disadvantage that we have no war on for the spectacular collapse in army recruitment since the company took charge. It also reports on 4 members of the Arctic Group 30 being granted bail after spending 2 months in jail in Russia. The Telegraph leads its front page reporting that an independent inquiry has been ordered into how the Reverend Paul Flowers was appointed chairman of a major British bank amidst allegations Labour Party covered up concerns about his conduct. It also reports on Britain's survival rate for cancer and strokes, which are on par with Eastern Europe, despite government promises to improve care for those with these conditions. It also features a picture of the Duchess of Cambridge attending a conference run by a children's mental health charity, who is keen to ensure other children do not suffer bullying the way she did in school. The Times leads its front page with the headline, 4 Britons die fighting for Al-Qaeda in Syria amidst fears that jihadis returning from the war are a growing terrorist threat. It also reports on the Church of England turning its back on decades of division and voting overwhelmingly in favour of women bishops. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. Two and a half years after the brutal Syrian civil war, and with the chemical weapons destruction, let's continue our coverage on the situation. In an article headlines, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Syrian chemical arsenal could be destroyed at sea. The Jerusalem Post looks at the chemical watchdog option for disposing toxic agents in event that no country agrees to process on its soil. The Jerusalem Post refers to the world's chemical watchdog, who said on Wednesday that Syria's arsenal of over 1,000 tons of chemical weapons could be disposed at sea in the event that no country agrees to destroy them on its soil. The paper cites the OPCW spokesman Christian Chartier, who said, however, that this possibility doesn't exclude the fact that member states continue to think about the possibility of destroying them on land. The Jerusalem Post goes on to say that Albania rejected a US request to host the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons, dealing a blow to a US-Russian accord to eliminate the nerve agents from the country's protracted civil war. Albania, facing protests at home from groups complaining about the Adriatic country and NATO member was being exploited by the West, and it was impossible to get involved in the operation. The plan seeks to destroy about 1,300 tons of Syria's sarin, mustard gas and other agents. To conclude, the Jerusalem Post points out that a plan adopted by the OPCW in The Hague on Friday called for the most critical chemicals to be transported out by Syria by December 31st and destroyed between December the 15th and March the 15th. All other declared chemical materials would be eliminated by June the 30th. The Chicago Tribune features an editorial headline with "Destroying Syria Chemical Weapons is a Job for Russia," in which the writer discusses the mission of destroying the Syrian chemical weapons. According to the writer, the progress in destroying Syria's chemical weapons has been astonishingly swift and smooth, but even more complex and dangerous tasks loom. The paper sees that transporting huge stockpiles of chemicals by ground in the midst of the country's raging civil war without protection might cause rebels to seize control of the chemicals. The Chicago Tribune cites a senior American official who said, "One fear is that terrorists, including a strong contingent of Al-Qaeda affiliated with the rebels, will attack convoys to seize control of the chemicals." The paper points out that Damascus does not have facilities to destroy a 1,300-ton arsenal of volatile chemicals, so the stockpiles need to be moved to a nearby country willing to accept the challenge. So far, no takers. According to the paper, sending these chemicals over long distance is dangerous. This is a job that needs to be done closer to home. The paper argues that most obvious candidates is Russia. The Russians have extensive experience in dismantling their own chemical, biological and nuclear weapons, but Moscow is reluctant, reportedly because it is behind schedule in destroying its own chemical arms. To conclude, the Chicago Tribune sees that Putin needs to offer more than technical support. Putin has more to gain in ensuring these weapons are safely destroyed and more to lose if they are not. President Putin, time to ant up. You can't lead from behind on this. Rami Khouri writes from the Lebanese Daily Star an article headlined, "A book helps us navigate the Syria mess," in which he reviews a book titled The Syrian Dilemma, featuring 21 short essays on Syria. Referring to the Syrian issue, Khouri argues that the only thing one can do in the face of the persistent complexity, suffering and danger is to read the book in order to better grasp the dimensions of the Syrian situation and the various policy options that are suggested by many different actors. Khouri claims it is a perilous enterprise to publish a book on Syria in the midst of such rapidly changing conditions. He adds, "But I must note with admiration the small volume titled The Syrian Dilemma that was recently published by the Boston Review series of the MIT Press and edited by Nader Hashemi and Danny Postel, respectively the director and assistant director of the New Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver." Khouri states the variety of texts by Syrian and international writers aptly captures the lack of easy answers as to what should be done in Syria by the many local and foreign actors there. Khouri points out that co-editors offer essays to support the fact that Syrians and Arabs, and also Western liberals and neoconservatives, disagree on the best response to developments in and around Syria. Khouri adds, including about international humanitarian and security interventions arming Islamist rebels, negotiating a transition to a new political system in the country, and other related matters that remain both confounding and compelling. Towards the end of the article, Khouri quotes the editor's note, which says that this book is by no means the final word on the ethical dilemma that Syria poses, but it is an invitation to critical engagement with that dilemma. And to conclude, Khouri says, "If you wonder what can or should be done about the war in Syria, sitting down with this compact little book for a few hours is as good as a starting point as I have encountered to date." As negotiations between world powers and Iran on the future of Tehran's nuclear program resume, let's take a look at what analysts believe could be the outcome of the talks. The Washington Post's Max Fisher looks at a poll conducted by the Washington Post and ABC in his article, "Americans support an Iran nuclear deal 2-1, that's a big deal." Fisher reveals that the poll finds that 64% of Americans support a nuclear deal with Iran, while 30% disapprove of one. That's potentially very significant, as it could help sway Congress towards backing the deal, which it has tended to oppose. Congressional opposition is one of the things most likely to kill any agreement with Iran over its nuclear program, so this finding could reduce that risk by giving members of Congress a bit more political cover. Fisher highlights that it's true that polls have suggested for some time that Americans support negotiation and diplomacy with Iran. A late September poll by CNN found that 3 in 4 Americans supported direct diplomacy. A University of Maryland poll back in March 2012 reported that about 70% of Americans prefer diplomacy with Iran to military strikes. But according to Fisher, those polls dealt in generalities, as he believes it's easy to support negotiations in principle. It's much harder to support a specific deal, which would necessarily require US concessions, as well as placing a degree of trust in the Iranian government, which is not exactly popular here in the United States. Fisher goes on to add that members of Congress could undermine and potentially scuttle any deal with Iran by refusing to honor it. Such a deal would probably require rolling back sanctions and could attempt to derail it by increasing sanctions during negotiations. The writer adds that would be bad both because it would become the US negotiators look powerless, weakening them at the table, and because a pretty well-established principle of these sorts of diplomatic détentes is something called action for action. Fisher believes some members of Congress will probably oppose any deal with Iran on ideological grounds, but a number of them are probably also worried about their own political fates and see high risk in supporting a deal with little apparent reward. After all, if a deal succeeds, all the credit will go to President Obama and his administration. But if it's less than a total success, any congressman who supported it will be open to attack. According to Fisher, this new poll could free up members of Congress in how they approach the negotiations, giving them a bit more political space to support a deal that has such wide popular support despite political risks that could be a significant asset for the Obama administration in making any nuclear deal happen. Writing for Israel's Haaretz, V. Barzel says Iran is in dire need of an agreement both for the reduction of sanctions and to begin to relieve public pressure on the government, as he signals a deal could potentially be reached by the end of these talks. Barzel questions Iran talks, the first round or the last. Barzel says Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has a very valuable Iranian partner. Like Netanyahu, Muhammad Ali Jafari, commander of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, does not believe the Americans when they say that the military option is still on the table, referring to Jafari's comments saying they're afraid to attack Iran more than any other state, and it's not even a possibility, but they keep saying so for political reasons. Barzel adds the Iranians' working assumption as they arrive in Geneva on Wednesday for what could be the last round of talks before an agreement is that the moment such a deal is forged, the military option would be stricken from both official and public discourse. Barzel points out that in the past, Iran has demanded explicit American guarantees against an attack as a condition for willingness to restrict uranium enrichment, but that demand was rejected by then President Bush. Now it seems that Iran will be satisfied with an understanding that the military option will cease to exist. However, Barzel says it is still not clear what the Iranians intend to propose even after a week of exchanges with the Western powers. They might commit to stopping all activity at the Fordo facility, ceasing construction of the heavy water reactor at Iraq, or to possible nuclear inspection framework. According to Barzel, Iran is in dire need of an agreement not only for the easing of the sanctions it would entail, but also because an agreement would grant Iran a certificate of approval, marking it as a serious, committed state that can be trusted to enter into future agreements as well. Barzel believes this could have the potential to kick off a wave of investments, including future agreements to build industrial infrastructure, or refineries, or just purchase oil. The writer adds an agreement could create a new atmosphere in Iran. It could help to reduce the opposition to the government from both sides, liberal and conservative, and strengthen both Rouhani and Khamenei. Barzel continues to say that Iran, the Western states, and Israel are all troubled by the uncertainty surrounding the situation. The outcome of such an agreement could indeed be negative, and the West is concerned that it might pass the point of no return, after which the wall of sanctions could crack or even crumble. The writer finally concludes that according to the basics of the agreement, which were released before the current round of talks, the goal is to create a situation in which both sides, Iran and the West, will have mutual interest and motivation in proceeding to the next step after the first test of pace, adding that Iran made it clear that its goal is to reach a final agreement within 6 months to a year. On the same matter, writing for the Wall Street Journal, Ben Winkley takes a look at the Geneva talks. In his article, Iran talks resume, but there are no guarantees. Winkley mentions that in the last round of talks held earlier in November, a deal seemed possible, but then floundered on French intransigence, he says. Iran is being offered the carrot of defrosted assets and the suspension of pressure by Washington on countries not to buy Iranian oil. Winkley adds that sanctions have crippled the Iranian economy, and representatives from the P5+1 group of nations, the 5 permanent UN Security Council members plus Germany, will hope this will lead to a cede some ground on uranium enrichment. Winkley says that reopening the spigots in Iran would provide some headwinds for the price of oil. He adds that David Houghton from PVM, the oil professionals and the world's largest OTC oil broker, says a compromise with Iran will upset Israel, Saudi Arabia, every other Sunni state and congressional hawks, they will not be committed to a deal with Iran and US allies, may well feel abandoned and therefore free to act what they see as their own interests. A deal that allows Iran to continue enriching uranium even at low levels may well precipitate a race to become nuclear from Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Egypt. Winkley reiterates that for sure Israel is suspicious. Saudi Arabia, no fan of Tehran, no matter who is in charge there, also has interest to protect, not least within the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Referring to the bombings outside Iran's embassy in Beirut, Winkley says the attack serves as a reminder that below the international dimension to the Geneva talks simmers a fractured region made even tenser by Syria's continued civil war. The writer concludes that whether or not Iran has been brought to the table by sanctions, there is lingering domestic distrust of the Geneva process. Many in Iran want nothing to do with a compromise. If an agreement is reached this week and there is no guarantee, it isn't likely to be an immediate panacea for a long-term correction in the price of oil. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. The international New York Times leads with the headline, "Germany is burdened as physical state buckles." The UAE's Gulf News leads with the headline, "How long before Lebanon is torn apart after the Iranian embassy in Beirut suffers bomb blasts?" Russia's Moscow Times leads with the headline, "Putin and Netanyahu meet for talks as the two leaders discuss Israel's disapproval of a potential international nuclear agreement with Iran, among other regional security issues." And finally, Tehran Times leads with the headline, "Iran will not retreat one step from its nuclear right after comments from Supreme Leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei." That was all for today. I'll see you tomorrow for another press review.